So in this video, I'd like to talk about genetics of cancer 2, particularly talk about two things: hereditary cancers and viruses. So there's something fishy here. So in our first video on cancer, we talked about how somatic mutations are central to cancer. But you've heard of cancers running in the family. Perhaps you've heard of BRCA1, which is very important for breast cancer. And you've also heard of cancers being caused by viruses, for instance, maybe HPV. So what's going on here? So in this video, I'd like to clear this up. So let's think about what's weird about this. So we talked about our three kinds of different mutations, right? Of inherited mutations that our parents have and we got from them, de novo germline mutations that are not in most of our parents' somatic cells, but that occurred in the germline cell that gave rise to us, and then somatic mutations, which only occur in a subset of our cells, or occurred in one cell within us and is now only present in a subset of our cells. So if we think about this, when we talk about cancers, we're talking about mostly somatic mutations. And so then we're talking about mutations if for instance, our parent had somatic mutations that gave rise to cancer. Well, by definition, and from what we know about somatic mutations, these somatic mutations should not be present in the gamete that gave rise to us. So what's going on here? Well, a lot of times what's happening when we talk about somatic mutations is not a single mutation that causes cancer, but rather a mutation that makes us more likely to develop cancer. So here we're talking about our two tumor suppressor genes, our two copies, our two alleles of the tumor suppressor gene. And so often what these mutations are is a mutation in one of these. So this one mutation can get passed down. And what happens then is that makes the cell line more likely, more vulnerable to getting a second mutation that totally abolishes the function of this protein. So we can say that in words. In hereditary cancers, often one allele, the inherited allele, is mutated, and that makes it much more likely that a cell will mutate and end up with 0 functional copies of that gene. And so let's see what that would look like. So then that would mean, so here's our parent, and that parent has one mutation in each cell out of the 2 copies. So these are our 2 tumor suppressor genes. It's got and our parent has a mutation in 1 copy. So that means our parent may have accumulated a second mutation in the second copy, an orange somatic mutation, which would then lead to tumor formation. So let's see what happens in us. Well, we're not necessarily going to inherit this mutated allele. Our parent is heterozygous for this mutation through most of their body. And so we might actually inherit a non-mutated copy and also a non-mutated copy from our other parent, in which case we will not have any inherited mutations. And if we get a somatic mutation, it won't be as dangerous because it will be covered up by the intact other allele. However, if we inherit the mutated copy from our parent, now we are similarly vulnerable to mutations just like our parents were, and now if we get a mutation, we could end up with the same form of tumor. So it's under these circumstances, this is sort of how hereditary cancers largely get passed down, through a mutated copy of one of our 2 alleles, which makes our cells more vulnerable to additional mutations. So in general, inheritance of some mutation or mutations that make it so that fewer somatic mutations are necessary to progress to cancer. And so maybe most famously is BRCA1, in which about 3 to 8% of Americans have an inherited mutation in BRCA1, and BRCA1 mutations, inherited mutations, play a role in about 20% of breast cancers. And women who inherit certain BRCA1 mutations have about an 85% chance of developing breast cancer by age 90. The second topic I'd like to cover is how viruses get involved in cancer. And so here, maybe the most famous one of these is the human papillomavirus, which is responsible for most cancers of the cervix, and it's also responsible for some cancers of the vagina, vulva, penis, anus, rectum, and oropharynx. pharynx, which is the back of the throat. So there's actually now a vaccine that's freely available to girls, but in some states and some places there's really low vaccination rates, unfortunately, possibly due to the discomfort that some parents feel about vaccinating their young daughters for a disease that's of sexual nature, sexual transmitted. But in fact, HPV is the most common STD in America, with more than a quarter of the population infected. So what do viruses have to do with diseases that are caused by somatic mutations? If cancer is caused by somatic mutations, then how are viruses involved? Sorry, excuse me. Sorry. So first is that sometimes viruses can cause mutations. So certain kinds of viruses insert directly, their DNA inserts directly into human chromosomes, which could potentially affect the expression of genes near the insertion site. But we think that that's fairly rare. Another important one is some viruses, in particular HIV, deplete the immune system. So the immune system is important for recognizing abnormal cells that have abnormal proteins on their surfaces. And so the immune system is really important for fighting tumors, particularly early in progression. And the lack of this immune function can increase the incidence of some cancers. And finally, viruses can promote cell division and block cell death, leading to persistence and proliferation of mutant cells. And that's the one we're going to talk about a little bit more. Okay, so here we're looking at the viral life cycle. So this is a viral particle here. So it's a little bit hard to see, but it's a protein capsid, protein outer coating, and then DNA inside. So it attaches to a cell and injects the genetic information, DNA or RNA, depending on what kind of virus it is. And then this injected information gets replicated. So we have 4 copies here. The genes on this genetic information are then expressed to give rise to these viral coat proteins. The viruses are then assembled, and then the virus breaks out of the cell. So that's kind of classic example of the viral life cycle, showed here for a bacterium. But everything that's shown here is very similar for eukaryotic viruses. So in humans, viruses are actually quite vulnerable when they're outside of the cell. Humans have a very well-developed immune system that can recognize viral particles and eliminate them from the bloodstream or from the intracellular space. And so when viruses break out of the cell, they're actually particularly vulnerable. So another strategy is actually to stay in the cell and to cause the cell to replicate. So to increase your copy number, not by breaking out of the cell and invading other cells, but just causing the cell you're in to replicate more. And so one thing is to just copy it more. Another way to ensure that the virus is present in many copies is to block apoptosis. So usually apoptosis would recognize that the cell is infected. And so the apoptosis process in human cells recognizes when there's something wrong with the cell, any number of things wrong, and then kills the cell so that it won't become dangerous. And so often when the cell is infected, it would undergo apoptosis. But viruses actually are optimized to keep the cell alive, and therefore have evolved to block apoptosis. And so the way that this will actually work is very direct. So often the viral gene will produce a viral protein, and that protein will then cause degradation of some negative regulator within the human cells, so that protein is degraded, and suddenly these genes can be turned on, promoting cell progression or blocking apoptosis. And in fact, in multiple cases, this is done by our old friend ubiquitination. The viral protein causes some down-regulatory human protein to have ubiquitin added to it, and then the protein is degraded. So basically, here are the viral contributions to cancer. They disrupt cell cycle checkpoints. So this is good for the virus because it leads to more cell division, but it's bad for us because it leads to unrepaired DNA damage and unequal division during mitosis, and so aneuploidies. It can block apoptosis. This is good for the virus because the cells that the virus is in, will survive. But it's bad for us because these cells that have DNA damage and other abnormalities survive. So viruses lead to cells with more mutations undergoing more division, which contributes to cell progression. And so the role of hereditary mutations in viruses and cancer are both they're sort of similar. They don't cause cancer, but they make it more likely that cancer will develop. So hereditary mutations decreases the number of mutations necessary for tumor formation, so it just makes the cell more vulnerable. And viruses increase cell proliferation and survival of damaged or mutant cells. So that doesn't neither directly cause cancer, but they make it much more likely that a cell will accumulate all the mutations necessary for cancer.